The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Sarah Martinez walked through the gates for what she thought would be another routine day. She had been stationed at Fort Harrison for 6 months now, serving as a communications specialist with the 82nd Signal Battalion. At 24, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from excelling in her field, though she had learned to keep her head down around certain members of her unit. The trouble had started 3 weeks ago when she had politely declined Sergeant Rick Thompson's invitation to dinner. Thompson, a burly man in his 30s with a mean streak that seemed to grow wider each day, had not taken the rejection well. What followed was a campaign of subtle harassment that made Sarah's daily life increasingly difficult. Equipment would go missing from her station, her work would be scrutinized beyond reason, and whispers would follow her through the corridors. Sarah had reported the incidents through proper channels, filing complaints with her immediate supervisor and, eventually, with the base's Equal Opportunity Office. But Thompson had friends in high places, and her complaints seemed to disappear into a bureaucratic void. The harassment escalated when she refused to back down, her resolve only strengthening Thompson's determination to break her spirit. On this particular morning, Sarah noticed something was different as soon as she entered the communications building. The usual chatter among her colleagues died down to whispers, and she caught several people staring at her with expressions that ranged from pity to barely concealed excitement. Her stomach tightened with a familiar dread as she made her way to her workstation. Lieutenant Jake Morrison, Thompson's closest ally, and a man who seemed to take pleasure in others' misfortune, approached her with a smirk that made her skin crawl. "Martinez," he said, his voice carrying across the room louder than necessary, "you're wanted in conference room B. Immediately." Sarah's heart began to race, but she maintained her composure. "What's this regarding, sir?" "You'll find out," Morrison replied, his grin widening. "Trust me, you'll want to see this." As Sarah walked toward the conference room, she could feel the eyes of her colleagues following her. Some looked away when she met their gaze, while others watched with the morbid fascination of people witnessing a car accident. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before her, each step echoing with an ominous finality. Conference room B was typically used for briefings and administrative meetings. As Sarah approached the door, she could hear voices inside, Thompson's distinctive laugh among them. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and knocked. "Enter," came Thompson's voice. Sarah opened the door to find herself facing a tribunal of sorts. Thompson sat at the head of the conference table, flanked by Morrison and 2 other sergeants she recognized but didn't know well. Behind them stood several junior enlisted personnel, their faces a mixture of anticipation and discomfort. The setup felt more like a kangaroo court than any official military proceeding. "Specialist Martinez," Thompson began, his voice taking on an official tone that didn't match the malicious gleam in his eyes. "We've received several complaints about your conduct and appearance standards." Sarah's mind raced. She knew her conduct had been exemplary, and she took pride in maintaining proper military appearance. "I'm not aware of any issues with my conduct or appearance, Sergeant." Thompson pulled out a manila folder and made a show of opening it. Multiple reports of insubordination, failure to follow direct orders, and he paused dramatically, repeated violations of grooming standards. "That's not true, Sergeant," Sarah said firmly. "I maintain all appearance standards in accordance with AR 670-1. Morrison leaned forward, his expression mockingly serious. "Are you calling Sergeant Thompson a liar, Martinez?" The room felt like it was closing in around her. Sarah realized this was a setup, but she also knew that any resistance would only make things worse. "No, sir. I'm simply stating that I believe there may be a misunderstanding." Thompson stood up slowly, his 6-foot frame towering over the table. "Well, let's clear up this misunderstanding right now. According to these reports," he waved the folder, "your hair has been observed extending beyond the collar of your uniform on multiple occasions." Sarah's hand instinctively went to her hair, which was properly secured in a regulation bun at the nape of her neck. "My hair meets all regulatory requirements, Sergeant." "Not according to these witnesses," Thompson said, gesturing to the group behind him. Several of them nodded, though Sarah could see the reluctance in their expressions. Fear, she realized. They were afraid of Thompson, too. The sergeant reached into a bag beside his chair and pulled out a pair of electric clippers. The sight of them made Sarah's blood run cold. "Since you seem unable to maintain proper grooming standards on your own, we're going to help you out." "Sergeant, this is highly irregular," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the terror building inside her chest. "Any corrective action for appearance standards should go through proper channels." "This is the proper channel," Thompson replied. "I'm your direct supervisor, and I'm ordering you to sit in that chair so we can fix your hair problem once and for all." Sarah looked around the room, searching for any sign of support, any indication that someone would speak up for what was right. Instead, she saw either hostile faces or people desperately trying to avoid eye contact. She was alone, trapped in a situation that was spiraling beyond her control. "I request to speak with the first sergeant," Sarah said, playing her last card. Thompson's laugh was cold and humorless. "First Sergeant Williams is off base for the next 3 days. Looks like you're stuck with me." He plugged in the clippers, and their mechanical buzzing filled the room like the sound of approaching doom. "Sit down, Martinez. That's a direct order." Sarah felt her world tilting. She knew that refusing a direct order was a serious offense, but what Thompson was proposing wasn't legitimate military discipline. It was personal revenge disguised as authority. Yet in this room, surrounded by his supporters, who would believe her version of events? "Sergeant, please," she said quietly. "This isn't right, and you know it." Thompson's face hardened. "What's not right is a soldier who thinks she's above following orders. You've been nothing but trouble since you got here, Martinez. Maybe it's time you learned some humility." The clippers buzzed louder as he moved toward her. Sarah found herself frozen, caught between her training to follow orders and her instinct for self-preservation. The other soldiers in the room watched with varying degrees of discomfort, but none spoke up. "Last chance, Martinez. Sit down, or I'll have you restrained for insubordination and failure to follow a direct order." Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could refuse and face court-martial charges that would end her military career. She could report this later, but it would be her word against multiple witnesses who were already under Thompson's influence. Or she could submit to this humiliation and hope that somehow justice would find its way to her later. With tears of rage threatening to spill from her eyes, Sarah slowly walked to the chair that Thompson had indicated. The metal was cold against her back as she sat down, her hands gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Smart choice," Thompson said, moving behind her. "Now let's fix this little grooming problem of yours." Sarah closed her eyes as she felt Thompson's rough hands remove the pins from her hair. Her dark brown locks, which she had grown for years and kept meticulously maintained, fell in waves past her shoulders. It was beautiful hair, healthy and shining, and Thompson seemed to take particular pleasure in running his fingers through it before starting the clippers. "Such pretty hair," he said mockingly. "Shame it's not regulation." The first pass of the clippers sent a shock through Sarah's system. She felt the vibration against her scalp, felt the weight of her hair falling away in chunks. The mechanical buzzing seemed to echo in her skull as Thompson methodically shaved her head, taking obvious pleasure in each pass of the blade. Around the room, the spectators watched in uncomfortable silence. Some had clearly expected this to be entertaining, but the reality of watching a fellow soldier being systematically humiliated was proving more disturbing than they had anticipated. A few of the junior enlisted personnel looked sick, but fear kept them silent. Morrison provided commentary, as if he were watching a sports match. "Looking better already, Martinez. Much more regulation." Sarah kept her eyes closed, trying to disconnect from what was happening to her. She thought about her family back home, about her younger sister who looked up to her for joining the military. She thought about her dreams of serving her country with honor, of advancing through the ranks, and making a difference. Those dreams felt very far away now. The clippers continued their work, and Sarah could feel the cool air of the room against her newly exposed scalp. Thompson wasn't just cutting her hair short. He was shaving it down to the skin, leaving her completely bald. Hair continued to fall around the chair like dark snow, piling up on the floor around her feet. "There," Thompson said finally, switching off the clippers. "Much better. Now you definitely meet grooming standards." Sarah opened her eyes and immediately felt the sting of tears she could no longer hold back. She could see her reflection in the window across the room, a stranger staring back at her, completely bald, looking more like a cancer patient than a soldier. The humiliation was complete. Thompson walked around to face her, his expression one of satisfied cruelty. "Let this be a lesson, Martinez. Follow orders, maintain standards, and Show proper respect to your superiors. Any questions? Sarah tried to speak, but found her voice trapped somewhere between rage and devastation. She simply shook her head. Good. You're dismissed. And Martinez. Thompson's voice stopped her as she stood to leave. If you think about filing any complaints about today, remember that everyone in this room will testify that this was a legitimate corrective action for appearance violations. Your word against all of ours. As Sarah walked toward the door, she could feel the weight of all those eyes on her naked scalp. Her feet carried her mechanically through the corridors of the communications building, past colleagues who stared in shock and whispered behind her back. Some looked at her with pity, others with curiosity, but none with the outrage she felt this situation deserved. She made it to the restroom before the tears finally came in full force. Standing before the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The person staring back was a victim, something she had sworn never to become. Her hands shook as she touched her bare scalp, feeling the slight stubble that the clippers had left behind. The bathroom door opened, and Corporal Lisa Chun, one of the few people on base Sarah considered a friend, entered. Chen's face went white when she saw Sarah. "Oh my God," Chen whispered. "What did they do to you?" Sarah couldn't speak. She just stood there, tears streaming down her face, looking like a broken shell of her former self. Chen moved to the door and quickly locked it, then returned to put her arms around Sarah. "This is not okay. This is not remotely okay. We have to report this." "To who?" Sarah finally found her voice hoarse with emotion. "Thompson has witnesses. He has the power. Who's going to believe that this wasn't legitimate?" "Someone will listen," Chen insisted. "This is abuse of authority. This is harassment." Sarah shook her head, immediately regretting the movement as it reminded her of her missing hair. "I tried reporting him before. Nothing happened. Now, it's only going to be worse." Chun held her friend tighter. "We'll find someone. There has to be someone on this base with integrity." But as they stood there in that locked bathroom, both women knew the harsh reality. In the military hierarchy, rank often trumped right, and Thompson had successfully isolated Sarah from any meaningful support. The humiliation was just the beginning. Now she would have to face the entire base looking like this, a walking advertisement of what happened to soldiers who crossed the wrong people. Outside the bathroom, the day continued as normal. Soldiers went about their duties, following orders, maintaining discipline. But something had changed at Fort Harrison. A line had been crossed, and the comfortable assumption that the system would protect good soldiers from bad leaders had been shattered for everyone who witnessed or heard about what happened in Conference Room B. Sarah spent the rest of that day hiding in administrative tasks that kept her away from the common areas of the base. But she knew she couldn't hide forever. Tomorrow would come, and with it the challenge of facing her duties and her colleagues with dignity intact despite what had been done to her. That night, she stared at herself in her quarters mirror for a long time, trying to find some trace of the confident soldier she had been that morning. The woman looking back was still Sarah Martinez, still a skilled communication specialist, still someone who believed in serving her country. But she was also now someone who understood that the uniform didn't always protect you from those who wore alongside you. As she lay in bed that night, Sarah made a decision. She wouldn't let this break her. Somehow, some way, she would find justice. Not just for herself, but for every soldier who had been silenced by fear or intimidated by those who abused their authority. She didn't know how yet, but she would make sure that Thompson and his supporters learned that humiliation was not the same as victory. The military had taught her about duty, honor, and courage. Tomorrow, she would need to draw on all three to face whatever came next. Her hair would grow back, but her determination to see justice done would remain as strong as ever. Thompson had won this battle, but the war for her dignity and her career was far from over. The days following Sarah's humiliation passed like a waking nightmare. Word of what happened in Conference Room B had spread throughout Fort Harrison with the speed that only military gossip could achieve. Some stories painted Thompson as a strict disciplinarian maintaining standards, while others whispered about the abuse of power. But regardless of how people interpreted the event, Sarah found herself the center of unwanted attention wherever she went. Walking to the mess hall had become an ordeal. Conversations would stop mid-sentence when she appeared, replaced by stares and whispered comments. Some soldiers looked at her with sympathy, others with curiosity, and a troubling number with barely concealed amusement. The baseball cap she wore did little to hide her condition, and removing it for meals left her feeling exposed and vulnerable. Thompson had been clever in his cruelty. By framing the head shaving as a disciplinary action for grooming standards, he had created a narrative that many soldiers found believable. After all, the military was built on strict adherence to regulations, and appearance standards were taken seriously. Those who didn't witness the event firsthand could easily accept that Sarah had somehow brought this upon herself. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Sarah, who had always taken pride in her professional appearance, now felt like a walking billboard advertising her supposed failures. The military culture that emphasized conformity and following orders worked against her. Questioning Thompson's actions meant questioning the authority structure itself, something most soldiers were reluctant to do. Corporal Chun remained Sarah's only reliable ally, but even their friendship was being tested by the hostile environment. Chun found herself facing subtle pressure from other NCOs to distance herself from Sarah. Assignments that would normally go to Chun were being reassigned to other soldiers, and she noticed that her own work was being scrutinized more closely than usual. "They're trying to isolate you completely," Chun said during one of their private conversations in Sarah's quarters. "Thompson knows that if you don't have any support, you'll either break or leave." Sarah ran her hand over her still bare scalp, a nervous habit she had developed. "Maybe leaving would be better. I don't know how much more of this I can take." "That's exactly what he wants," Chun replied firmly. "You're one of the best communications specialists on this base. Your work is flawless, your record is clean, and you've never caused any real problems. Thompson is threatened by you, and he's using his position to destroy someone he can't control." The truth of Chen's words didn't make living through it any easier. Sarah's work performance, which had always been exemplary, began to suffer under the constant stress. She found herself making small errors that would never have happened before, mistakes that Thompson was quick to document and exaggerate. Each mistake became evidence of her supposed incompetence, feeding into the narrative that she was a problem soldier who needed constant supervision. The communications unit operated on trust and teamwork, but that foundation was cracking. Other soldiers were afraid to be seen supporting Sarah too openly, worried that Thompson's attention might turn to them next. The few who tried to show kindness did so secretly, an encouraging word in passing, a brief pat on the shoulder when no one was looking. These small gestures of humanity meant more to Sarah than their givers could know, but they also highlighted just how isolated she had become. Lieutenant Morrison seemed to take particular pleasure in Sarah's situation. He would find excuses to check her work multiple times a day, often calling her over to his desk to question her procedures in front of other soldiers. His criticism was always technically within bounds. He never quite crossed the line into obvious harassment, but the cumulative effect was devastating to Sarah's confidence and standing within the unit. "Martinez, explain this discrepancy in your transmission log," Morrison would say, his voice carrying across the work area. Even when the discrepancy was minor or non-existent, the public questioning served its purpose of undermining her credibility. The base chaplain, Captain Rodriguez, made an attempt to reach out to Sarah during her third week of isolation. He was a kind man who genuinely cared about the soldiers under his spiritual guidance, but he was also naive about the realities of power dynamics in military units. "I've heard you've been having some difficulties," he said during their private meeting in his office. "Sometimes when we face challenges, it's an opportunity to grow stronger in our faith and our character." Sarah appreciated his concern, but she could see that he didn't truly understand what she was facing. "Chaplain, this isn't about character building. This is about abuse of authority and systematic harassment." Captain Rodriguez nodded sympathetically, but Sarah could tell he was uncomfortable with the implications of her words. "Have you considered that perhaps this is a test of your ability to overcome adversity? Sometimes the military puts us in difficult situations to see how we respond." The conversation left Sarah feeling even more alone. Even those who meant well seemed unable to grasp that what was happening to her wasn't normal military discipline or an unfortunate misunderstanding. It was deliberate, calculated destruction of her career and dignity. The physical reminders of her humiliation were constant. Her hair was beginning to grow back, but slowly, leaving her with patchy stubble that somehow looked worse than complete baldness. She had started wearing scars when off duty, but on duty the military regulations required her to be bareheaded indoors. Every mirror she passed was a reminder of what had been done to her. Sleep became elusive. Sarah would lie awake replaying the events in conference room B, thinking of all the things she should have said or done differently. Her mind would cycle through potential courses of action, filing complaints, requesting transfers, going to the media, but each option seemed to lead to more problems rather than solutions. The isolation was affecting her physically as well. She lost weight, her appetite suppressed by constant stress. Dark circles under her eyes testified to sleepless nights. Her hands developed a slight tremor that she tried to hide during equipment operations. The confident, competent soldier she had been was being systematically erased. During her 4th week of isolation, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Master Sergeant Patricia Williams, a woman in her 40s who worked in the base's personnel office, appeared at Sarah's workstation during a quiet afternoon. "Martinez, I need to speak with you privately," Williams said quietly. They stepped outside the communications building, away from listening ears. Williams looked around carefully before speaking. "I've been hearing things," she said. "Things that don't sit right with me. I want you to know that not everyone on this base thinks what happened to you was appropriate." Sarah felt a flicker of hope for the first time in weeks. "Are you willing to help me file a formal complaint?" Williams' expression grew pained. "I wish I could, but Thompson has connections that go all the way up to battalion level. I've seen what happens to people who cross him directly. I have kids to feed, and I can't risk my career." The hope died as quickly as it had emerged. "Then, why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to know that you're not alone, even if it feels like you are. And because I want you to be careful. Thompson isn't finished with you yet." That evening, Williams' warning proved prophetic. Sarah returned to her quarters to find that her room had been searched. Nothing was missing, but her personal belongings had been subtly disturbed. Photos were slightly crooked, drawers weren't quite closed properly, and her laptop had clearly been moved. The message was clear: nowhere was safe, and Thompson's reach extended beyond official duty hours. The psychological pressure was mounting beyond what Sarah thought she could bear. She began to understand how people in her situation might simply give up, accepting defeat rather than continuing to fight a system that seemed designed to protect those in power regardless of their actions. The military's emphasis on hierarchy and obedience, which she had always respected, now felt like a weapon being used against her. Chen found Sarah sitting on her bunk that night, staring at a photo of her family back home. Her sister's graduation picture showed a young woman full of hope and pride, believing that her older sister was serving with honor and distinction. Sarah wondered what her family would think if they could see her now. "I keep thinking about getting out," Sarah admitted to Chun. "Maybe I should just request a transfer or even leave the military entirely. Start over somewhere else." "You could do that," Chun said carefully, "but you'd always know that they won. And the next woman who doesn't play Thompson's game will face the same thing you're facing now." The weight of that responsibility felt crushing. Sarah had joined the military to serve something larger than herself, to be part of an organization that stood for honor and justice. Now she was learning that those ideals didn't always protect good soldiers from bad leaders. The 5th week brought new torments. Thompson had arranged for Sarah to be assigned to the night shift, ostensibly to help with personnel coverage, but actually to further isolate her from the support system she might find during normal duty hours. Working alone in the communications center from midnight to 8 in the morning, she had plenty of time to think about her situation and very little human contact to break the cycle of rumination. During one of these lonely nights, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She began documenting everything, every interaction with Thompson and Morrison, every instance of harassment, every witness who might be willing to speak up. She started keeping a detailed journal, recording dates, times, and exact conversations. If she was going to fight this, she would need evidence, and she would need to be smarter about it than she had been before. The base library became her refuge during off hours. It was one of the few places where she could be alone without feeling exposed, where she could research military regulations and procedures without attracting attention. She studied the Uniform Code of Military Justice, memorizing the relevant articles about abuse of authority and harassment. She researched successful cases where enlisted personnel had prevailed against corrupt leadership. What she learned was both encouraging and terrifying. The system did have safeguards, but using them required courage, persistence, and often significant personal sacrifice. Many cases dragged on for months or years, and even when justice was eventually served, The whistleblowers often found their military careers effectively over. But she also found examples of soldiers who had stood up to corruption and won. Officers and NCOs who had been court-martialed for abuse of power. Systemic changes that had been implemented after brave individuals refused to accept the status quo. These stories gave her hope, even as they demonstrated the long and difficult road ahead. As Sarah sat in the library one evening, reading about military justice procedures, she made a vow to herself. She would not be broken by Thompson's campaign of harassment. She would document everything, build an unshakable case, and find someone in the chain of command with the integrity to act on it. Her hair would grow back, but more importantly, she would reclaim her dignity and her career. The isolation was meant to weaken her, but instead it was teaching her to rely on her own strength. The humiliation was meant to shame her into silence, but instead it was fueling a determination to ensure that no other soldier would face what she was facing. Thompson had underestimated his victim, and that mistake would eventually cost him everything. Night after night, alone in the communications center or the library, Sarah planned her counterattack. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every soldier who had ever been silenced by fear, every woman who had faced harassment in uniform, every person who believed that the military should live up to its highest ideals rather than protect its worst actors. The war Thompson had started was far from over, but Sarah was no longer just defending herself. She was preparing to go on the offensive, and when she was ready, her enemies would discover that humiliating someone and defeating them were very different things. 7 weeks had passed since the incident in Conference Room B, and Sarah's hair had grown into a short, uneven fuzz that she kept hidden under regulation caps whenever possible. The daily humiliation had become routine, but beneath the surface, something was changing. Sarah was no longer the broken soldier Thompson thought he had created. She was methodically building a case that would bring down everyone involved in her persecution. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Private First Class Miguel Santos, one of the junior soldiers who had been forced to witness her head shaving, approached her during a quiet moment in the communications center. Santos was 19 years old, fresh from technical school, and had been struggling with what he had seen that day. "Specialist Martinez," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "I need to tell you something about that day in the conference room." Sarah's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "What about it, Santos?" "I recorded it," he whispered. "Not the whole thing, but part of it. I had my phone in my pocket, and when I saw what was happening, I started recording. I knew it wasn't right." Sarah felt like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "You have video evidence?" Santos nodded, his young face filled with guilt and fear. "I've been carrying this around for weeks, not knowing what to do with it. I'm scared of what Thompson will do to me if he finds out, but I can't sleep at night knowing what really happened and not doing anything about it." This was the break Sarah had been praying for. Video evidence would make it impossible for Thompson to maintain his fiction about legitimate disciplinary action. "Santos, you could be saving not just my career, but the careers of other soldiers Thompson might target in the future." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm telling you. But what do we do with it?" Thompson has friends everywhere. Sarah had been researching this exact question for weeks. "We need to go outside the normal chain of command. There are procedures for reporting corruption when the local leadership is compromised." That night, Sarah and Santos met in the base library after hours. Santos showed her the recording on his phone, 3 minutes of grainy footage that clearly showed Thompson forcing her into the chair and shaving her head while making degrading comments. The audio captured his mockery and Morrison's commentary, making it clear that this was about humiliation rather than military discipline. "This is enough," Sarah said, her voice shaking with emotion as she watched herself being violated on the small screen. "This proves everything." But even with evidence, Sarah knew she needed more than just Santos' testimony. She needed witnesses who could corroborate the pattern of harassment that led to this moment. Over the following weeks, she carefully approached soldiers who had witnessed Thompson's behavior over the months preceding the incident. The process was delicate and dangerous. Sarah had to identify soldiers who had integrity and courage while avoiding those who might report her activities back to Thompson. She started with Corporal Chun, who had been documenting her own observations of the harassment campaign. Chun brought another witness, Sergeant First Class David Kim from the motor pool, who had heard Thompson bragging about putting Martinez in her place at the NCO club. Kim was a 15-year veteran who had grown disgusted with Thompson's behavior but had been waiting for someone to take the lead in challenging him. I've seen Thompson destroy 3 careers since I've been here, Kim told Sarah during a secret meeting in his personal vehicle off base. He targets anyone who doesn't fall in line or who threatens his authority. You're not the first, and you won't be the last unless someone stops him. Kim provided crucial information about Thompson's network of supporters and how they had protected each other from previous complaints. He also knew about a previous incident where Thompson had sexually harassed a female soldier who had ultimately transferred to another base rather than continue fighting. Her name was Specialist Rebecca Martinez, Kim said. Different Martinez, no relation to you. She filed complaints, but Thompson's people closed ranks. She left the military altogether rather than deal with it anymore. Sarah realized that her case was part of a larger pattern of abuse that had been going on for years. Thompson wasn't just a bully. He was a systematic predator who used his position to destroy anyone who challenged him. The fact that she happened to share a last name with a previous victim seemed like more than coincidence. The next breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Master Sergeant Williams, who had warned Sarah weeks earlier about being careful, contacted her through Chun with new information. Williams had been quietly investigating Thompson's activities and had discovered financial irregularities in the unit's equipment accounts. Thompson has been skimming money from equipment purchases, Williams explained during a clandestine meeting at a coffee shop in town. Small amounts, but it adds up. He's been using his position to approve inflated invoices and pocketing the difference. I have documentation. This changed everything. While the harassment and abuse were serious charges, financial fraud would trigger an automatic investigation that couldn't be buried by Thompson supporters. Military investigators took theft of government funds very seriously, and the evidence Williams had collected would force an external investigation regardless of local politics. Sarah now had video evidence of the assault, witness testimony about the harassment campaign, and documentation of financial crimes. But she still needed to figure out how to present this information to someone who had both the authority and the integrity to act on it. The answer came from her research into military justice procedures. The Inspector General's office existed specifically to investigate cases where local command structures were compromised. Every major base had an IG representative who reported directly to higher headquarters, bypassing the local chain of command. Colonel Janet Harper was Fort Harrison's Inspector General representative. A stern woman in her 50s with a reputation for thorough investigations and intolerance for corruption, she had the authority to launch formal investigations and protect whistleblowers from retaliation. Getting to see her would require going through proper channels, but once Sarah had her attention, she could present her entire case at once. Sarah spent 2 weeks preparing her presentation. She organized all the evidence chronologically, created a timeline of events, and prepared witness statements from everyone who was willing to come forward. Santos had transferred the video to a secure drive, and Williams had copied all the financial documentation. The package was comprehensive and damning. The formal appointment with Colonel Harper was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. Sarah had told no one except her core group of allies, but somehow word had leaked. Thompson seemed to sense that something was happening, and his behavior became increasingly aggressive in the days leading up to the meeting. Martinez, he called out during a formation on Thursday morning, I want to see you in my office after duty hours today. Sarah knew this wasn't a coincidence. Someone had tipped Thompson off, and he was making one last attempt to intimidate her into silence. But after weeks of preparation, she wasn't going to be deterred by threats. The meeting in Thompson's office was exactly what she expected. He didn't explicitly threaten her, but his message was clear. Drop whatever she was planning, or face consequences that would destroy her military career permanently. I've been hearing rumors, Thompson said, leaning back in his chair with false casualness. Rumors about soldiers who don't understand how to work within the system. Soldiers who think they can cause problems for their leadership without facing consequences. Sarah maintained her composure. I'm not sure what rumors you're referring to, Sergeant. Let me be clear about something, Martinez. This unit works because soldiers follow orders and respect the chain of command. When that breaks down, everyone suffers. And soldiers who break that down tend to find themselves facing very serious charges. I understand the importance of following lawful orders and respecting legitimate authority, Sarah replied carefully. Thompson's eyes narrowed. I hope you do, because if I were to discover that someone was spreading lies about their leadership or trying to undermine unit cohesion, I would consider that a very serious threat to good order and discipline. The conversation was a masterclass in military-style intimidation, technically within bounds, but clearly threatening. Thompson was gambling that fear would make Sarah back down at the last moment, just as it had worked with previous victims. But Sarah had spent too many weeks building her case and gathering her courage to be deterred now. I appreciate your guidance, Sergeant. Will that be all? Thompson studied her face, looking for signs of weakness. When he didn't find them, his expression hardened. That will be all. For now. That night, Sarah met with her group of supporters one last time before the IG meeting. Santos was nervous but determined. Chun was ready to face whatever consequences might come. Kim and Williams understood that they were risking their careers, but believed it was the right thing to do. Whatever happens tomorrow, Sarah told them, I want you all to know that you've shown real courage. Standing up to corruption and abuse isn't easy, especially when it means challenging the system we've all sworn to serve. Chun squeezed her hand. We're doing this for every soldier who comes after us. Thompson's reign of terror ends tomorrow. Friday afternoon arrived with unseasonable storm clouds gathering over Fort Harrison. Sarah made her way to Colonel Harper's office with a briefcase full of evidence and a heart full of determination. She had been preparing for this moment for weeks, but she also knew that everything depended on Harper's willingness to listen and act. The IG office was located in the headquarters building, away from Thompson's direct sphere of influence. As Sarah walked through the corridors, she passed soldiers going about their normal duties, unaware that one of their colleagues was about to trigger an investigation that would shake the foundation of Fort Harrison's power structure. Colonel Harper's secretary, a professional civilian woman in her 30s, showed Sarah into the office promptly at 1,400 hours. Harper was exactly what Sarah had expected, a no-nonsense officer who radiated competence and integrity. Her office walls were covered with certificates and commendations spanning a 25-year career. Specialist Martinez, Harper said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. I understand you have some concerns about your unit that you'd like to discuss. Sarah took a deep breath. Everything she had endured, everything she had planned for, came down to the next hour. Ma'am, I have evidence of systematic abuse of authority, harassment, assault, and financial fraud within the 82nd Signal Battalion. I believe these crimes have been covered up by corrupt leadership, and I'm requesting a formal investigation. Harper's expression didn't change, but Sarah could see the interest in her eyes. That's a serious accusation, Specialist. I hope you have substantial evidence to support it. Sarah opened her briefcase and began laying out her case. The video from Santos' phone played on Harper's computer, showing clearly what had really happened in Conference Room B. The witness statements painted a picture of systematic harassment and intimidation. The financial documents Williams had provided showed a clear pattern of fraud. For over an hour, Sarah methodically presented her evidence, while Harper asked pointed questions and took detailed notes. The colonel's expression grew more serious as the scope of the corruption became clear. Specialist Martinez, Harper said finally, this is indeed very serious. If these allegations are proven, they represent multiple violations of military law and federal statutes. Are you prepared to testify formally about these events? Yes, ma'am. And I have witnesses who are also prepared to testify. Harper nodded slowly. Very well. I'm opening a formal investigation as of this moment. You and your witnesses will be placed under whistleblower protection, which means any retaliation for cooperating with this investigation will itself be a serious crime. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. After weeks of isolation and fear, someone with real authority was finally taking her seriously. Thank you, ma'am. Don't thank me yet, Harper warned. This investigation will be thorough, but it will also be difficult. Thompson and his associates will likely fight back hard. Are you prepared for that? Sarah thought about everything she had already endured and everything that was at stake. Ma'am, I've been fighting this battle for weeks already. I'm ready to see it through to the end. Harper smiled for the first time since the meeting began. Good, because we're going to need that determination to clean up this mess. As Sarah left the IG office that afternoon, she felt lighter than she had in months. The storm clouds that had been gathering all day finally broke, sending rain pouring down on Fort Harrison. But for the first time since that terrible day in Conference Room B, Sarah walked through the rain with her head held high, knowing that justice was finally within reach. The investigation moved swiftly once Colonel Harper set it in motion. Within hours of Sarah's meeting with the Inspector General, teams of investigators from the Criminal Investigation Command arrived at Fort Harrison. They came quietly, without fanfare, but word spread quickly through the base that something significant was happening. Thompson's first indication that his world was crumbling came on Monday morning when he was summoned to report to the base commander's office immediately. Major General Patricia Morrison, no relation to Lieutenant Morrison, was a career officer known for her zero tolerance for corruption and her unwavering commitment to military justice. The presence of CID investigators in her conference room made it clear that this was no routine meeting. Sergeant Thompson, General Morrison began without preamble. You are being relieved of all duties pending the outcome of a criminal investigation. You will surrender your access cards, weapon, and any government equipment in your possession. You are confined to base pending further orders. Thompson's face went white. He had expected some pushback from Sarah's complaints, but he hadn't anticipated a full criminal investigation. General, I believe there's been some misunderstanding. Whatever Specialist Martinez has told you, this investigation encompasses far more than harassment allegations. The general cut him off. We have evidence of financial fraud, abuse of authority, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. You will be formally charged within the next 72 hours. As Thompson was escorted from the building, Lieutenant Morrison and the other members of his inner circle were receiving similar notifications. The investigation had moved beyond the original complaints to encompass everyone who had participated in or enabled the corrupt activities of the 82nd Signal Battalion's leadership. Sarah learned about these developments from Corporal Chun, who had witnessed Thompson's dramatic removal from the communications building. He looked like he'd seen a ghost, Chun reported. Morrison, too. They're rounding up the whole crew. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. As CID investigators dug deeper into the unit's records, they uncovered evidence that the corruption extended far beyond what Sarah and her allies had documented. The financial fraud was more extensive than Williams had discovered, involving tens of thousands of dollars over several years. More disturbing still, they found evidence of a broader conspiracy to silence and remove soldiers who posed threats to the corrupt network. The breakthrough came when investigators gained access to Thompson's personal computer and phone records. What they found painted a picture of systematic criminal activity that shocked even seasoned investigators. Email chains showed detailed planning of harassment campaigns against multiple soldiers. Text messages revealed coordination between Thompson, Morrison, and several other NCOs to fabricate evidence and manipulate witnesses. Most damaging of all, they found records of communications with personnel at other bases. Thompson's network extended beyond Fort Harrison, involving NCOs and officers at multiple installations who had been sharing information about problem soldiers and coordinating transfers and negative evaluations to drive unwanted personnel out of the military. Colonel Harper called Sarah to her office 3 days after the investigation began. Specialist Martinez, what we've uncovered goes far beyond what you initially reported. You've helped us expose a conspiracy that has been operating across multiple bases for several years. Sarah was stunned. How many soldiers have been affected? We're still investigating, but preliminary evidence suggests at least dozens of careers have been damaged or destroyed by this network. Your courage in coming forward has potentially saved countless future victims. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Investigators found evidence that Thompson and his associates had been targeting soldiers for a variety of reasons. Women who refused sexual advances, soldiers who reported safety violations, anyone who questioned irregular procedures or showed too much initiative. The head-shaving incident that had triggered Sarah's complaint was just one example of the psychological warfare these corrupt leaders had been waging against good soldiers. As word of the investigation spread throughout Fort Harrison, other victims began coming forward. Sergeant First Class Maria Lopez, who had transferred to another base 6 months earlier, returned to testify about harassment she had endured. Staff Sergeant Robert Chun, Corporal Chin's older brother, provided evidence about how he had been forced out of the Army after questioning Thompson's equipment purchases. The pattern was always the same. Identify a target, manufacture problems to justify harassment, escalate the pressure until the victim either broke or left, then cover up the evidence and move on to the next target. The system had been refined over years of practice, and Only Sarah's refusal to be quietly driven away had finally exposed it. But the biggest revelation was still to come. On Thursday of that week, investigators made an arrest that sent shockwaves through the entire base command structure. Command Sergeant Major William Harrison, the senior enlisted advisor to the base commander, was taken into custody for his role in the conspiracy. Harrison, a respected 28-year veteran, had been using his position to coordinate the corrupt network across multiple units. Email evidence showed that he had been the central figure organizing transfers of problematic NCOs to units, where they could continue their activities without oversight. He had also been instrumental in burying complaints and protecting corrupt leaders from investigation. The arrest of such a senior leader changed everything. This was no longer a case of a few bad NCOs abusing their authority. It was a systematic corruption of the enlisted leadership structure that reached the highest levels of the base hierarchy. General Morrison immediately called for a complete review of personnel actions taken over the past 3 years, and the investigation expanded to include several other installations where Harrison's associates were stationed. Sarah found herself at the center of a media storm as news of the scandal broke beyond military circles. Reporters from major news outlets began calling, seeking interviews about her role in exposing the corruption. The military's public affairs office worked to control the narrative, but the story was too big to suppress. Whistleblower exposes military harassment network, read the headline in the Army Times. Female soldiers' courage reveals years of systematic abuse, proclaimed a major newspaper. Sarah's decision to stand up to Thompson had triggered an avalanche that was reshaping how the military dealt with internal corruption. The personal cost of her courage was still significant. Despite the vindication of the investigation, Sarah continued to face challenges from soldiers who remained loyal to Thompson or who blamed her for bringing negative attention to the base. Some accused her of being a traitor to the military, while others suggested she was seeking attention or financial gain. But for every critic, there were 2 supporters. Soldiers from across the base and beyond reached out to thank her for her bravery. Letters and emails poured in from military personnel who had faced similar situations and felt hopeless until seeing that change was possible. The Army's senior leadership, embarrassed by the scope of the scandal, publicly praised Sarah's courage and commitment to military values. The most meaningful support came from unexpected quarters. General Morrison personally called Sarah to her office to express her gratitude. "Specialist Martinez, what you've done has helped us clean house in a way that was desperately needed. You've upheld the best traditions of military service by refusing to let corruption flourish unchallenged." Even more surprising was a visit from Command Sergeant Major Elizabeth Rodriguez, Harrison's replacement, who had been brought in from another installation to help rebuild the base's enlisted leadership structure. Rodriguez was a no-nonsense leader with a reputation for integrity and fairness. "I want you to know," Rodriguez told Sarah during their meeting, "that what happened to you will never happen again on my watch. We're implementing new procedures to ensure that complaints are investigated properly and that soldiers who come forward are protected." The criminal proceedings moved quickly. Thompson, Morrison, and several other defendants pled guilty to various charges in exchange for reduced sentences and cooperation with ongoing investigations. Thompson was sentenced to 4 years in military prison and dismissed from the Army. Morrison received 3 years and forfeiture of all benefits. Several other participants received lesser sentences, but were also dismissed from service. Command Sergeant Major Harrison's case was more complex due to his senior rank and the scope of his involvement. He faced court-martial on charges that included conspiracy, fraud, and violations of his oath of office. The military prosecutors were seeking a sentence that would send a clear message that corruption at any level would not be tolerated. As the legal proceedings unfolded, Sarah began to rebuild her career and her confidence. Her hair had grown back into a stylish shortcut that actually looked better than her previous long hair. More importantly, she had rediscovered her sense of purpose and pride in serving her country. The 82nd Signal Battalion was reorganized under new leadership, with several NCOs brought in from other units to replace those who had been removed. The toxic culture that Thompson had created was systematically dismantled and replaced with an environment focused on professional excellence and mutual respect. Sarah's technical skills, which had been overshadowed by the harassment campaign, were finally recognized and rewarded. She received a promotion to sergeant and was selected for advanced training that would prepare her for leadership roles. The Army was investing in her future as a way of demonstrating that soldiers who stood up for what was right would be supported and advanced. But perhaps the most significant change was in Sarah herself. The experience had transformed her from a competent but quiet soldier into a leader who understood the importance of speaking up against injustice. She began volunteering as a mentor for junior soldiers, particularly women who were facing challenges in male-dominated units. "What I learned," she told a group of new soldiers during a leadership seminar, "is that staying silent about wrongdoing doesn't protect you. It only enables it. When we see corruption or abuse, we have a duty to report it, not just to protect ourselves, but to protect everyone who comes after us." The scandal at Fort Harrison became a case study in military leadership schools, used to teach future officers and NCOs about the importance of maintaining ethical standards and creating environments where soldiers could report problems without fear of retaliation. Sarah's story became part of military history, an example of how one person's courage could expose systemic corruption and create lasting change. As the first phase of investigations concluded, Sarah received an unexpected phone call from the Pentagon. The Army's Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel wanted to meet with her to discuss her experiences and recommendations for preventing similar situations in the future. The girl who had been humiliated and isolated was now being consulted by the Army senior leadership about how to make the military better. The transformation was complete. From victim to survivor to advocate, Sarah had traveled a difficult road that had ultimately made her stronger and more determined than ever to serve with honor. The worst day of her military career had become the catalyst for changes that would protect countless soldiers who would never know her name, but would benefit from her courage. But even as she prepared to meet with senior leadership in Washington, Sarah knew that her journey was far from over. There were more battles to fight, more soldiers to protect, and more changes to be made. Thompson's network had been destroyed, but the conditions that allowed it to flourish still existed in other units and at other installations. The work of reform would continue, and Sarah Martinez would be a part of it. 6 months had passed since the investigation began, and Fort Harrison was slowly rebuilding its reputation. The corruption scandal had made national news, resulting in congressional hearings and sweeping changes to military harassment reporting procedures. Sarah Martinez had become an unlikely symbol of courage and integrity, but she remained focused on her duties as a newly promoted sergeant in the reformed 82nd Signal Battalion. The base was preparing for a routine change of command ceremony when unexpected orders arrived from the Pentagon. A special inspector from the Army's highest levels would be conducting a final review of the reforms implemented at Fort Harrison. What made this unusual was that the inspector would be arriving unannounced, observing operations without the typical preparation and fanfare that accompanied high-level visits. Sarah first learned about the mysterious visitor from Corporal Chun, who had heard rumors in the administrative offices. "Someone important is coming," Chun reported during their lunch break. But nobody knows exactly who or when. The command staff is nervous. The nervousness was understandable. Despite the successful prosecution of Thompson's network and the implementation of new procedures, Fort Harrison's leadership knew they were still under scrutiny. The corruption scandal had embarrassed the Army at the highest levels, and careers had been damaged by association, even among those who hadn't been directly involved in the criminal activities. Sarah had mixed feelings about another high-level review. While she appreciated that the Army was taking the situation seriously, she had grown weary of being repeatedly asked to recount her experiences for investigators, reporters, and officials. She wanted to focus on moving forward rather than constantly revisiting the past. The mystery visitor arrived on a Tuesday morning in late spring. A nondescript government sedan pulled up to the base headquarters, and a single passenger emerged. Those who caught a glimpse described a tall figure in civilian clothes carrying a simple briefcase. No entourage, no advance team, no obvious signs of rank or authority. Just one person walking purposefully toward the building. General Morrison, the base commander, was as surprised as anyone when her secretary announced that she had a visitor who claimed to be conducting an official review. "General Thompson to see you, ma'am," the secretary said, clearly confused by the informal arrival. General Morrison's confusion deepened when a figure in civilian clothes entered her office. The visitor was a woman in her late 50s with silver-gray hair and an unmistakable bearing that spoke of decades of military command. Despite the civilian attire, there was no mistaking the authority that seemed to radiate from her presence. "General Morrison," the visitor said, extending her hand. "I'm Lieutenant General Catherine Thompson, Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel. I'm here to conduct a personal review of the reforms implemented at Fort Harrison." Morrison's face went white. Lieutenant General Thompson was one of the most senior officers in the Army, a woman whose career had been marked by unwavering integrity and innovative leadership. Her presence at Fort Harrison, unannounced and without the usual protocol, suggested that this review was far more significant than anyone had anticipated. "General Thompson," Morrison stammered, "I had no idea you were coming. If we had known, we would have prepared. That's exactly why I didn't announce my visit," Thompson replied with a slight smile. "I want to see how things really operate here, not how they look when everyone is on their best behavior for a VIP visit." What General Morrison didn't know, what no one at Fort Harrison knew, was that Lieutenant General Thompson had a personal connection to the case that went far beyond her official duties. She had been following Sarah Martinez's story since the beginning, not just as a senior Army officer concerned about military justice, but as someone who had faced similar challenges early in her own career. 35 years earlier, as a young lieutenant, Catherine Thompson had been sexually harassed by a senior officer at her first assignment. When she reported the incident, she faced retaliation that nearly ended her military career before it began. She had survived and ultimately thrived, but she had never forgotten the feeling of being alone and powerless in the face of systematic abuse. Thompson had risen through the ranks by being smarter, tougher, and more dedicated than her peers. She had broken barriers as one of the first women to command at various levels, and she had made it her mission to ensure that future generations of female soldiers wouldn't face the obstacles that had marked her early career. When the Fort Harrison scandal broke, Thompson had personally directed the investigation from Washington. She had read every report, reviewed every piece of evidence, and followed every development in the case. Sarah Martinez's courage had reminded her of her own younger self, and she was determined to ensure that the lessons learned from this case would create lasting change throughout the Army. Now, walking through Fort Harrison in civilian clothes, Thompson was conducting her own assessment of how well those changes had been implemented. She spent the morning observing training exercises, talking informally with soldiers, and reviewing operational procedures. But Thompson's real purpose in coming to Fort Harrison wasn't just to assess the reforms. It was to personally thank Sarah Martinez and to deliver news that would change her life forever. Sarah was working at her station in the communications center when she received an unusual message. "Sergeant Martinez, report to conference room B immediately." The location sent a chill down her spine. It was the same room where she had been humiliated months earlier. She hadn't been back inside since that terrible day. Taking a deep breath, Sarah made her way to the conference room. She steeled herself for whatever might be waiting, though she couldn't imagine what new development might require her attention. The reforms had been implemented, the criminals had been prosecuted, and life had finally returned to normal. When she opened the door to conference room B, Sarah found herself face to face with a woman she didn't recognize, but whose presence immediately commanded respect. The stranger was seated at the same table where Thompson had orchestrated Sarah's humiliation, but the atmosphere in the room was completely different. "Sergeant Martinez," the woman said, rising from her chair. "Thank you for coming. I'm Lieutenant General Catherine Thompson." Sarah's mind raced. She recognized the name from news reports about the scandal, but she had never expected to meet such a senior officer in person. "General, ma'am," she said, snapping to attention. "At ease, Sergeant. Please have a seat." Thompson's voice was warm, but carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to command at the highest levels. "I want to talk with you about your experience here and about your future in the Army." As Sarah took a seat, in a different chair than the one where she had been forced to endure her humiliation, she couldn't help but notice the symbolism. The room that had once been the scene of her lowest moment was now hosting what felt like a very different kind of meeting. General Thompson began by sharing something that surprised Sarah. "Sergeant Martinez, I want you to know that your case has had impact far beyond Fort Harrison. The courage you showed in standing up to corruption has led to changes in harassment reporting procedures Army-wide. But more than that, your story has inspired countless soldiers who have faced similar situations." "I appreciate that, ma'am," Sarah replied, "but I was just doing what any good soldier would do." Thompson smiled. "That's exactly the kind of attitude we need more of in the Army. But I want you to understand something. What you did wasn't routine. It took extraordinary courage to challenge a corrupt system, especially when you had no guarantee that anyone would listen or that justice would prevail. The general paused, her expression becoming more serious. I also want you to know that I have personal experience with the kind of harassment you faced. Early in my career, I dealt with similar situations. I survived and advanced, but I never forgot what it felt like to be powerless in the face of abuse. Sarah was stunned. The idea that this senior general had faced similar challenges was both shocking and oddly comforting. How did you get through it, ma'am? The same way you did, by refusing to give up and by believing that the Army could be better than its worst representatives. But I also had advantages you didn't have. I had mentors who protected me, and I was fortunate to serve under leaders who valued integrity over loyalty to corrupt peers. Thompson leaned forward, her voice taking on an earnest quality. That's part of why I'm here today. The Army failed you initially, Sergeant Martinez. The system that should have protected you instead allowed you to be victimized. We can't change what happened, but we can ensure that your sacrifice leads to meaningful reform. What kind of reform, ma'am? Thompson opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Based on your case and the investigation it triggered, we're implementing new procedures at every Army installation. Harassment reporting will now bypass local chains of command when corruption is suspected. We're creating independent investigation units that report directly to senior commanders. And we're establishing protection programs for soldiers who report misconduct. The scope of the changes was impressive, but Thompson wasn't finished. We're also creating a new position at the Pentagon, a special advisor for military justice reform. This person will be responsible for monitoring harassment cases, ensuring proper investigations, and recommending policy changes to prevent future incidents. Sarah nodded, impressed by the comprehensive nature of the reforms. That sounds like it could make a real difference, ma'am. It will, Thompson said firmly, but only if we have the right person in that position. Someone who understands the challenges from personal experience. Someone who has demonstrated courage under pressure. Someone who has the respect of both junior enlisted personnel and senior leadership. The general paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. Sergeant Martinez, I'm here to offer you that position. Sarah felt as though the air had been knocked out of her lungs. Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand. You would be promoted to staff sergeant and assigned to the Pentagon as a special advisor to the Army senior leadership. Your job would be to help ensure that what happened to you never happens to another soldier. You would have the authority to investigate harassment cases, recommend policy changes, and work directly with congressional oversight committees. The offer was staggering. 6 months ago, Sarah had been a humiliated specialist whose career seemed to be over. Now she was being offered a position of significant influence at the highest levels of the Army. General, I'm honored by this offer, but I have to ask, am I qualified for such a position? I'm still relatively junior in rank and experience. Thompson's expression grew serious. Sergeant Martinez, you've already proven your qualifications in the most difficult way possible. You've demonstrated integrity under pressure, courage in the face of retaliation, and commitment to justice even when it cost you personally. Those are the qualities we need in this position. She paused, then added, moreover, you understand the problem from the perspective of those who need protection most. Too often, reform efforts are led by senior officers who mean well, but don't fully understand what junior soldiers actually experience. You do. Sarah thought about the implications of accepting such a position. It would mean leaving Fort Harrison, where she had finally found her place again. It would mean taking on responsibilities far beyond anything she had ever imagined. But it would also mean having the power to prevent other soldiers from enduring what she had experienced. There's something else you should know, Thompson continued. The previous Sergeant Thompson, no relation to me, obviously, had been targeting soldiers like you for years. Our investigation revealed that you were part of a pattern, not an isolated incident. There are other soldiers out there who need someone to speak for them, someone who understands what they're going through. The weight of that responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders. She thought about all the soldiers who might still be suffering under corrupt leadership, who might be facing harassment and abuse with no one to turn to. The position Thompson was offering would give her the power to help them. Ma'am, Sarah said finally, if you believe I can make a difference in this role, then I accept. Thompson smiled, and for the first time since entering the room, her formal composure softened slightly. "I knew you would. That's exactly the answer I was hoping for." The general stood and extended her hand to Sarah. "Congratulations, Staff Sergeant Martinez. Your new assignment will begin in 30 days. That will give you time to wrap up your duties here and prepare for your move to Washington." As they shook hands, Sarah felt a sense of completion that she hadn't experienced since this whole ordeal began. The room where she had been humiliated and broken down was now the place where she had been offered an opportunity to help transform the entire army. The symbolism was not lost on either woman. "One more thing, Sergeant," Thompson said as they prepared to leave the conference room. "What happened to you in this room was a terrible abuse of authority. But your response to that abuse has created changes that will protect thousands of future soldiers. Sometimes our worst experiences become the foundation for our greatest contributions." As Sarah walked out of conference room B for what she knew would be the last time, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a victim. Today, she was a catalyst for change. The humiliation that was meant to break her had instead forged her into someone with the strength and authority to ensure that such abuse would never again go unpunished. The bald head that had been a symbol of her degradation had grown back stronger. The confidence that had been shattered had been rebuilt on a foundation of purpose and justice. The career that had seemed finished was now beginning its most important chapter. Thompson and his supporters had tried to humiliate her into silence. Instead, they had created a leader whose voice would be heard at the highest levels of the military for years to come. The woman walking out of that conference room was no longer just Sarah Martinez, the soldier who had survived harassment. She was Staff Sergeant Martinez, the architect of reforms that would protect generations of future soldiers from the kind of abuse she had endured. As word of her promotion spread through Fort Harrison, soldiers who had witnessed her lowest moments now saw her elevated to a position of unprecedented influence. The message was clear. In the United States Army, courage and integrity would ultimately triumph over corruption and abuse. The general had arrived to deliver justice, but she had also revealed that sometimes the greatest victories come not from avoiding our battles, but from fighting them with such courage that they transform not just ourselves, but the entire world around us.